Good morning, everyone. Some of you may have noticed no risers. Some of you may not know why they're up there last week. We had a preschool program, so hopefully you heard about that because most of you were asked, if you could, to make some Christmas cookies, which they were very well received. We had compliments from lots of people about how great and tasty they were, so thank you for doing that. But I want you guys to know that this place was packed last Sunday night with cute little kids up here on the stage and parents and grandparents out there, including me and my parents and Katie's parents, watching a little boy that stood about right here wandering around singing Jingle Bells and lots of other great Christmas songs. And it was just a really fun time, but it was really neat to see all the families here that our preschool has a connection with, and that we have a lot of them that are here that have no idea or don't believe and follow who Christ is. So I just want to say thank you to Susan, Aaliyah, and her staff for doing such an amazing job with the Christmas program, but also with a great job of loving on those kids. Our daycare, our preschool staff does a really good job with that. And then Susan and Aaliyah and the rest of the staff are doing a much better job and continuing to get better at just how they love the whole family. And trying to be a light through us here at this church to those people that come here to just have their kids watched. So we're trying to bridge that gap and make an intentional attempt to try to get people to Christ through that. So know that they are doing a great job at starting that, and it's not easy. There's a lot of stress. That means Susan, Aaliyah, and some of the other staff get caught up in a lot of drama. That isn't normal drama that they should have to get caught up into. But I appreciate all the hard work, and I know Sam does too, for those ladies. So thank you. Thank you for those who made cookies and showing some love from us to them. We did a great job, guys, so thanks. I want to get started because some of you know, because you got here early, I went a little over first service. My goal is not to do that twice. But I don't make any guarantees. There's a lot to cover with Mary. We have a lot of different scriptures we're going to be in, predominantly in Luke, but Matthew too. But we'll also get into a little bit of Mark and a little bit of John. So we'll be in the Gospels, and it's a good place to be. Obviously, if we're going to look at the story of Jesus, that's where we're going to be, and we're going to look at the story of Jesus' birth and just look at the story of lives who had some. At the beginning of Jesus' birth, like lenses. The way I saw this series when Sam and I talked about it a couple months ago was I saw it like the movie Vantage Point, if you've ever seen it, where they show you the beginning. At the beginning, they show the end of what kind of happens. And then by the end of it, you have all these different characters that you see their lens of what happened and how it got there. And then you find out who's the bad guy, why they did it, all these different things. And it's just kind of a really cool and neat movie if you haven't seen it. It's not for kids because there's lots of blood and those sorts of things, but it's a good, cool movie in that way. So don't go, hey, we're going to watch a family movie, and it's not that. So please don't. But that's kind of how I see this series being. We're trying to look at this idea of the season, the birth of Jesus, but see it through different people's lenses. And Sam has already talked about Herod and Joseph, and today I get to talk a little bit about Mary. But there's a lot to cover, and there's going to be some things that will be brought up from past stuff, from other people's lenses that kind of tie into things Mary maybe had to do because of Herod's lens or because Joseph. And like those will kind of be tied together a little bit maybe today. And know that when I'm talking about them, I think it has meaning to do with Mary. But I know when we say virgin birth and we talk about that, Amy sent a funny little text message to my wife talking about prayer for our children's pastors. All the kids are talking about and asking the question, what's a virgin? Because it is this weird kind of time of year where we talk about this miracle that happened that doesn't seem to make sense in a worldly place. Like we know, well, hopefully you know, those who are sitting here, that there's something that has to happen between a man and a woman to have a baby. And if you're called a virgin, that hasn't happened. That thing is sex, and it didn't happen between Mary and Joseph, but Mary had a baby. So what does that mean? What is that miracle? And sometimes it's hard maybe for you who are thinkers and kind of caught up in it. That doesn't make sense to me. Why did this happen? I want you to know when we read this, when we read the Bible, when we're looking at it, it isn't a story like a story about Santa Claus. This is truth. Matthew and Luke are the two Gospels that give about this first account of Jesus' birth and the fact that it was a virgin. Matthew would have been written by Levi, one of Jesus' disciples, who had 3 years of life on life with Jesus and probably also had access at some point in his life, a decent amount of access to Mary to hear the story firsthand from Mary, what happened and how this baby came to be of Jesus, how this man that he is following came to be. And then Luke is not a firsthand witness of Jesus, like he's not there. He's actually a follower with Paul and is actually a doctor back in the day and would have very well known what it meant to have babies and what it took, and would have probably been a big question when he's doing his investigation. If we look at Luke 1, 2, and 3, it talks about how he writes and how he, so if you want to open there, you can look for it yourself. Because I'm using so many passages, I'm just going to make reference. I want you to read it later or maybe read along as I'm referencing it so you know what it is. But in Luke 2, it talks about how he wasn't an eyewitness account, but he interviewed and carefully investigated and wrote down in chronological order what happened in Jesus' life. So Luke is a thinker. Luke is a processor. He did an investigation for us. Now, I know it says Theophilus. Oh, I'm getting them probably. Theophilus is how you say that. Yes, thank you. And some people think that is a person, but the ones who love God is what that means. And it could have been a person, but it could have been likely that someone financed it and knew that this was going to be important, because to hear the story of Jesus, his lifestyle, and over time, it would be very easy to minimalize him and to say that he was just a good person, that he did some nice things. But we probably needed to know that there's somebody who took the time to actually ask people some questions, not just one people, multiple people, and do a careful investigation and write down what really happened. So for me, that gives me great confidence knowing that Luke really kind of dives in the most to the actual birth of Jesus and just what happened there at the beginning with Jesus' birth. He writes the most about it and has the most detail. It gives me confidence that this isn't just a fake story or some fairy tale that like we want to believe, but this is truth. This happened. It's been researched. There's been accounts. We can trust that his investigation's right and that it's true. So for me, that gives me some confidence, and hopefully it can you too, because I know sometimes, even today, we struggle with miracles happening. Like we believe in God, but sometimes we limit his power to being like that's too big. But he is the God who created everything, and hopefully I believe that, hopefully you believe that. He spoke this world that we live in into life, and if he can do that, I believe he can pretty much do anything like have a virgin birth happen. But in that, we know that Luke is writing this for us and for us to have an account of what happened. And not only that, it's in chronological order, so it makes it kind of easy. We get to see Jesus kind of grow up a little bit, and we get some more references from his baby years to the preteens, the 12-year, we get a little hint of that, and just his life, then his ministry. Because most of the Gospels, when we read it, it's mostly just his ministry. Matthew has a little bit of lineage and a little bit of story of his birth, but not a lot. Mark and John have very little. John has in the beginning relating to his God, but that's to kind of who they're writing to. And John especially is writing to the disciples or to the Gentiles. He's making sure they know that Jesus was God. But Matthew and Luke would have been writing kind of for a fuller context. Matthew especially more to Jewish believers to try to prove the lineage and prove that this Messiah. Luke in the same way is doing some of that, but also making sure people know the full story. So as we look into this idea of Mary, I know that doesn't seem like it makes sense, but it kind of helps you know like why the birth is only in 2 stories. And as you look into it, if you want to research it a little bit more, you can. But let's dive right into that, into what I'm talking about in Luke 1. If you want to turn to Luke 1, we're going to be in 26 to 38. We know through Matthew and Luke that Mary is betrothed, that she's engaged to be wed to Joseph, but it has not happened. They're not married yet, but as Sam talked about last week, this is more than just an engagement. Like, Mary is now technically Joseph's. I know that sounds bad, but back in those days, women didn't have a lot of rights. Honestly, probably a wedding was still good and all that, but it was when you became a husband, you were his, kind of like you were. And I don't like that. I don't love that, but it's the truth, and that's kind of what it was. So if Mary, like Sam said, would have stepped out even during this betrothal period, she was promised to Joseph. There's a big problem there, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more. But Mary is living life, and Gabriel comes on the scene. And we know, and we can know about the age, just so you know, of Mary is between that 12 and 14 age. According to most scholars, that's when this betrothal period happened. So she's betrothed to Joseph, doing life, and Gabriel comes onto the scene, and she is in awe and in fear a little bit. Matthew 1, 26 through 38 of Gabriel, and he says, don't be afraid. Isn't it kind of interesting? I don't know what the angels look like, but it's interesting that most people that come in contact with them are somewhat afraid. I don't know if that's just because they're coming from the presence of God, and that is so holy and great that we're kind of afraid, or if they're different looking than maybe we think. I don't know. But Mary's afraid. He says, don't be afraid. You're highly favored by God, and basically lays out the fact that she is going to have God's son. Now, I think it's interesting that Mary's a teenager because I don't know about you, but I know at my age, especially if I was a girl, I'd have a lot more questions if Jesus said I'm going to have, or if Gabriel said I'm going to have the Son of God. But she just basically has this one question of, how's this going to happen? I'm still a virgin. Like, she knows enough to know that doesn't really make worldly sense. And he basically just says, well, the Holy Spirit, God, the Spirit's going to come upon you and you'll have a child. And then she's just like, okay. Like, I can think of 1,000 more questions, like, what's that going to look like? How's that going to feel? Like, all of these things. But as some of you know who work with teens, sometimes that's all it takes is, like, they have one question, and you think, like, you have to have this big, drastic answer. But if you just give the answer, then it's like, okay. And it's like, really? You're going to do it now? Like, that worked? That's the cool thing. And Mary says, okay. But something happens as we read in Luke, as she says, okay, that Gabriel gives her like a confirmation. Just this little bit of hint of, like, you can test this. Because I don't know what happens, but it talks about Mary in a couple days. She gets and runs to the hills. Like, she scurries out of town and goes to the hills to see Elizabeth. And the reason she's going to see Elizabeth is I think she needs that confirmation. She said okay, she said yes to birthing the Son of God. And some of you are like, well, that's not that big of a deal. It just means she's going to have a baby. But again, the story that Sam talked about last week with Joseph had every right when finding out that Mary is pregnant and he didn't do it, to stone her and kill her. Like, it was life or death. And if nothing else, if that wasn't the path that he took, another path that was pretty likely that he could take is he could basically divorce her and make her an adulterous woman that could never get married again and never have a life, a job, a living. So she might not die on the spot, but she might live and have to endure a life of poverty and shame for the rest of her life. So I'm sure that finally clicked with Mary. Like, oh, I have to tell Joseph that I'm pregnant, and that means consequences. So the question I had this week, and I asked some of you on Wednesday night, and I asked Sam, and it doesn't 100% matter, so I'm not going to spend as much time as I did last week or first service. But the question I had was this. Before she goes and sees Elizabeth, does she tell Joseph? Or does she wait until she gets back? I know the movies typically show her getting back and taking off her jacket or this thing, and then Joseph seeing this baby bump, and that's when he's like, oh. That's the way I would lean to be truth, just because of the fact of we know later on Joseph is known to not be the father. So usually when you come back 3 months pregnant and you hadn't really been with your husband much, people are going to talk and know. But we don't know, and I don't know that it matters, but it was just something I was kind of pondering this week. Did she tell Joseph and then they scurry off to see Elizabeth, or did she have to have some confirmation before she even goes and see Joseph? Because if it was me, I might have said yes to something. I might have realized God wanted me to do something, but knowing I'm going to have to tell somebody where the consequences really happen, I'd probably want a confirmation before that happens. So Mary goes to Elizabeth, and we can see that in Luke 39 through 45, Luke 1, 39 through 45. She goes and visits Elizabeth, and as soon as she walks in, John, who is in Elizabeth's belly, Elizabeth, who is 6 months pregnant, and we know is a miracle birth, and as we read, as Gabriel tells Mary, he tells her about Elizabeth being pregnant, kind of this little bit of hope, this little bit of glimmer that God is already at work. And honestly allows Mary to have this confirmation and to go to Elizabeth, see that she's pregnant, and as soon as Elizabeth hears her and sees her, John jumps in her womb. And Elizabeth gets filled with the Holy Spirit and tells her how blessed she is because she is carrying the Messiah, the promised one. And Mary, I can't imagine not having so much joy, but still so much fear and pressure on her now to know that it's all true. This wasn't like Mary had a spicy taco the night before, had a dream, and it was weird, and now she's going to see if it's all true. Like, she now has found out, oh, that wasn't a dream. That angel really did happen. This is all true. It's going to happen, and I'm going to be a part of it. It would be humbling. It would be exciting. It would be fearful. All of these things all in one. And some of you guys know exactly how Mary felt, because you've had God break through in your life and tell you to do something, told you to go, and then you got this exact same confirmation or a confirmation of some sort, and it excites you, but it scares you, and you don't know exactly what it's all going to look like. And I'm sure that's kind of where Mary's at this point. She realizes this is true. This is going to happen. I'm going to have the Son of God. But I still don't know how it's all going to play out. As we keep reading in that passage and we see she finds out and she gives this awesome praise and prayer to God, and she's excited. We can kind of see her ecstaticness about all of this. But I'm sure there's still some of that fear of, can I really do this? She stays with Elizabeth, as we read there in that Luke passage. She stays with Elizabeth for 3 months. So in that 3 months, before she even got to Elizabeth, Elizabeth was 6 months pregnant. In that 3 months, most of you know 9 months means a baby. John was probably born, is my assumption. So she not only got to see Elizabeth and hear her give her praise and say that happened, but after that, she gets to see John be born and Zechariah speak again. A man who hasn't spoken in 3 months since she's been there. And this is a pastor. I mean, this is a religious leader. Like, this is a man who probably has a lot of words, like I have a lot of words sometimes, and hasn't said a word for 3 months, and now speaks again and gives this awesome praise and prophecy about how John is going to prepare a way for the Lord. Talk about another confirmation for Mary that this is going to happen. But she probably honestly needed it, because if the way I think, and maybe some of you think as you heard my question, now she has to go back to Joseph. Now here's the big wild card if she hasn't told him. If she has told him, she knows, not that big of a deal. But I would see this being the trip, making the trip a lot more scary back home, knowing if she hasn't told Joseph in that 3 months' time. She's going to tell Joseph that I'm having a baby. And well, she's probably not even going to tell him. She's probably, as most women know, at 3 months, it gets really hard to keep it quiet that you're not having a baby. Like there's something about you're a little bit of a bump, even if you're in the best of shape. Like most people can kind of tell. Now, most guys can kind of tell, but if they're smart like me, they're never going to ask because they don't want to be wrong. But people probably know what's going on. And Mary goes back to Joseph, probably somewhat afraid if this is the first time telling him, and tells him about her being pregnant. She gets another confirmation through Joseph by Joseph having an angel appear in his dream and telling him not to be afraid. We see this in Matthew 1, 18 through 25, where Joseph has this dream. An angel says, "Don't be afraid. This is of God. Take her as your wife." So she gets another confirmation that this is really God's son, that her husband, supposed to be husband, the person that she's betrothed to, the person she's engaged to, will still take her as his wife. Now, one of the cool things that I think is about this whole story in the Mary and Joseph part is, as we read in Mark 6, like Sam talked about last week, people knew that Jesus wasn't Joseph's boy. It talks about in Mark 6 how that Jesus, it's son of Mary. And most of you know, back in those days, if you had a father, that's who you were the son of. Your son of, it should have been the correct label for those, if they would have thought it was Joseph's son, would have been son of Joseph. But they knew, probably because Mary was gone for 3 months and came back pregnant, that wasn't Joseph's boy. But they knew Mary had him. So both, by saying yes, the best case scenario that Mary and now Joseph has accepted by having her as his wife is to be known and be gossiped about because Mary's having a child, but it's not Joseph's. Both of them had to endure this label throughout life that something happened there, and the only worldly explanation is Mary did something wrong and that Joseph still accepted her to be a wife. Like if you're looking strictly from a non-God point of view, Mary ran out on Joseph, but Joseph still accepted her. So I'm sure throughout the lifetime of Jesus and throughout Mary and Joseph's lifetime, that kept getting brought back up. That Joseph, that's not your son. Mary, you did something wrong. We know it. We know it. And they probably both had a label and a stigma on them that none of us would really enjoy. But because God gave a dream, because God gave confirmation to Mary through Elizabeth, Zechariah, and Joseph had this dream, they were able to endure that and to say, okay, that's what it is. And then they get more confirmation. See, all this confirmation to me happens at the beginning of this because I'm sure there was lots of things happening and lots of questions and stories being made up about Mary and Joseph that they probably needed some confirmation. Because I don't know about you, but when God calls me to go do something and God's called me to be a part of his story, it usually doesn't make sense to the worldly story of those around us. Like it doesn't make 100% sense. Like we can get it, but we don't get it. And sometimes we start making up stories of why they do it. And I'm sure that's probably happened with Mary and for Joseph. And I'm sure they're hearing it and somewhat buying into it. And eventually we're going to find out they buy into it maybe a little too much. But Mary and Joseph probably needed some confirmation that what they said was told to them by angels is really happening and is going to happen. So they get some more confirmation. They get some more confirmation through the shepherds and the angels coming to see Jesus on his birth. We know he went to Bethlehem. We know he's been born. And it says in Luke 2, 8 through 20, it talks about these shepherds coming to see him, coming to take it all in. And the cool thing I like about this passage is as you read it, you hear and you see Luke tells us Mary kind of takes this all in. Like she's sitting there taking it all in, that these shepherds are here to worship and see the promised one. Like she gets to have this confirmation and just kind of take it all in And she's like honestly, there's probably part of her who's trying to grasp it all. Like, what does this now all mean? How do I raise the Son of God? But also, this is true. People are coming. Not just me and Joseph are hearing it. Not just Elizabeth family members are hearing about it. These shepherds who probably she had no idea who they were, now are coming to see her son. She's taking it all in. Then, if we keep reading in Luke 2, we see 8 days later, they go and do what the Jewish custom of going and getting Jesus circumcised. And they bring him into the temple. And this man of God named Simeon comes and gives him another confirmation. Basically saying, God's promise to me was that I would get to see the Messiah, that I would get to see salvation. And he takes Jesus and holds him and says, thank you, Lord, for letting me see this salvation. Not just for me, not just for the people around me, but for everyone. Like Simeon gets it. He gets how big this is. And I don't even know that Mary and Joseph totally do at this point, because I'm sure they think this is going to be a king who's going to restore them to power and authority. But Simeon is getting that this is going to be salvation, restoration for everyone. And he tells Mary that this is like the blessing it is, but also the simple truth of this is going to pierce your soul someday. Like this is going to hit you. This is going to happen. This is going to be like a sword into your side that's going to pierce your soul. And I think, hopefully, maybe it's just me, but I think there's a time where Mary, actually, you can see this happen. And hopefully it connects for you too. Maybe it was just me and maybe I'm off, but I kind of feel like God connected it for me. And I hope he does for you too. And then right after Simeon, Anna, this woman who is a widow and has been in the temple for years, just praying and fasting, comes up and gives another confirmation of who Jesus is and what he's there for, and giving praise to God for bringing him. So they get all these confirmations, and then as we know, and Sam kind of made mention last week, the wise men eventually come from the east, which there is something interesting to all of that. The east, we would assume, a lot of scholars assume they probably came from Babylon. And one of the cool things about all of this, the idea of Gabriel and the wise men, to me, I did a poor job of first service connecting this, so hopefully it connects a little bit better here. But Gabriel appears to Zechariah and Mary, but he also, in the book of Daniel, appears to Daniel in his prophecy of the future of what's to come and his prophecies that he's giving to the people there. And also, Daniel, as we know, Daniel and lions and all these things happen, and he becomes a man of power and authority, and his God would have been known not just by Jewish people that are there, but also the wise men of the time that probably would have been studying some of what his God said and what he believed. So these wise men could have been Jewish people who were still in Babylon, but they could have been just wise men who were counsel to those people at the time that were wise in the ways and studied multiple things, but knew that this meant something to Daniel's God. And they knew what Daniel did way back then, and that his God was powerful and amazing, so that they wanted to come and worship this king. That they knew that the prophecies that Daniel talked about, that they'd heard about, that this was coming true through that star, and that they come to worship the king. So Mary and Joseph, whether it's months, year, like it's been a couple years, now are coming to worship Jesus. They get another confirmation. But they also, as soon as those wise men come, as we looked at the story last week with Joseph, we know Herod, through the perspective of the first week that we did this series, gets really timid and realizes that his power, his authority, he gets intimidated by Jesus and hearing that there's another king. And we realize that that means there's a consequence now for Mary and Joseph and also for Jesus. Because Mary and Joseph know, I think, and have grasped that they have the Son of God, that they have the Messiah. And they probably somewhat assume that that's eventually going to be a king that's going to have power and authority. But Joseph has a dream and is told to flee to Egypt because bad things are going to happen. And we know from Herod's perspective that bad things do happen because he tells all these newborn boys that they need to be killed because he's trying to keep his power and authority. And in this, Mary and Joseph's, their lens changes. They go from probably having all of this confirmation of Jesus being the Messiah, being the king, to now realizing they have to raise him as a normal little boy. Like we can't talk about this. We can't make it open. We have to somewhat burden with this secret because if people know, he could be in danger because of Herod's lens. It's amazing to me how God tied this all together, how God used these different people and how it affects each one differently. And because of that, I'm sure Mary and Joseph started raising Jesus as a normal little boy. Gospels would kind of lead to that. If we keep reading in Luke 2, 41 through 52, we hear about 12 years later that Jesus and his family, Mary and Joseph, go to visit the Promised Land because there's a festival going on and they're doing traditions. They're doing what they normally should, like every other Jewish family should do. They're going and they go to be a part of it. And Mary and Joseph lose Jesus. Now, some of you are like, how can you not be a super hovering parent if you have the Son of God in your possession? Well, give them some grace. Where none of us are perfect. I forget to take my kid to preschool sometimes. I forget to sometimes give him a jacket. Like we're not perfect. Sometimes during church, he's running around because I feel like this is a safe place. Maybe that's a wrong assumption sometimes because anybody could walk in here. But I feel like it's a safe place. So sometimes I lose Zane. Some of you have seen me wandering around the hallways looking for Zane or Sophie. It happens. And in this time, Mary and Joseph aren't really bad parents. At this time, Mary and Joseph he's 12, and it's kind of a custom for Jesus to have some freedom to go hang out with family, and they maybe not go with him. So I'm sure when they're looking for him, they're going from family member to family member, looking for him, trying to find him with their family, with their blood relatives, because they probably assume that's where he's at, but they don't know because he's not with them. And they realize somewhere in all of this, they decide to go check out the temple. And Jesus gives them this reminder, kind of this little bit of glimmer of hope, this reminder. Mary, I get that you had me, but why wouldn't you think I'd be with my Father? Like he's sitting there teaching and talking to these religious leaders, and they walk in, and he looks at them kind of like, yeah, I'm with my Father. I'm in my Father's house. Why wouldn't I be here? Like Mary and Joseph, there's been some kind of little bit of a disconnect for both of them there. And the fact of they didn't know to go there first. You know what I mean? Like it says they've been looking for him, not just for a little bit, like for days, and they haven't found him, and then they finally go to the temple and find him. So there's been a little bit of disconnect, and we realize it gets even worse. Because like Sam said last week, Joseph kind of falls off the face of the map. We assume he must have passed away. But Mary is still alive when Jesus finally takes his ministry at roughly the age of 30. And some assumptions like Sam brought up last week, or some ways to think about it, of why did he wait till he was 30, might have been because his youngest siblings for Mary, Mary's littlest boy or daughter, would have been of age to go do their own thing. Now Jesus has the freedom, because he was the oldest, to not have to take care of the household. But that's all somewhat makes sense, but we don't know. But Jesus starts his ministry at age 30. He's called his disciples, and is starting to do some amazing things. And if we look at Mark 3, if you want to open up to that passage, 20 through 35, we see that Jesus is now, crowds are coming around him. People are hearing about him. He's doing some amazing things. And some of those things being casting out demons. And he's starting to get labels and things cast on him as far as being a demon himself who's casting out other demons. How he's getting a label of being a crazy man. And he's insane by some of these religious leaders who don't understand and don't see, haven't connected the dots. And it gets so bad, we read in Mark 3, that even his family starts to question this. Because he's in this house, it's crowded, and in Mark 3 there you can see, if you read for yourself, that his family comes thinking he's crazy and has someone there. And from what I'm told by some scholars that I trust, that was kind of a custom back then, that you can have families sometimes would get a religious leader, someone to come and give an evaluation of a crazy family member to see if he's really crazy and to tell you what to do. For example, some of us today might call that person a shrink, a psychologist, whatever, to do an evaluation, a professional that kind of knows how to evaluate those things and would do that, and then those family could do what they wanted, what needed to be done to help them. The thing is, that person back then probably would have been tied to these religious leaders. So it's not like it's an unbiased opinion. It's these people who are trying to cast doubt and trying to tell everybody that will listen that Jesus isn't who he seems to be. To try to cast out the fact that he's not the Messiah. So they come, they come to have him evaluated. And then in this is that whole thing where Jesus talks about how can a household be divided? How can a demon cast out a demon? That makes no sense, kind of competing what the religious leaders of the time are telling most people. And then someone shortly, almost right after that, comes up and says, hey, your mother and your family are outside. Your brothers and sisters, your mother are outside and they want to see you. And Jesus makes if you just read that passage right there, seems like a really harsh statement. He says, basically, I'm not going. That's not my family. My family's right here around me. And I think it was, one, meant to be harsh to his family a little bit. But if you think about it, it was a little bit of truth. And this, Jesus was sitting with those around him who were wanting to learn about his Father, learn about his God. So they are his family. Just like right now and today, we are a spiritual family. We are all sons and daughters of God. And if we are working and in tune with him, we should all be working towards a very similar mission, which is to see others come to know him. And what he has realized is that idea of his Father's family is right here around him. Yes, his blood family, his mom and his stepbrothers and sisters are outside at the door calling for him. But this is the family he came to be with, his spiritual family. He's realized that his mom, Mary, he realizes that his brothers and sisters are confused and have bought into the lies and have been overcome and now are questioning who he is and what he's about. Even though Mary had all these confirmations at the beginning of who Jesus was and who he's supposed to be, like that he was the Son of God, she's now had enough to think that he's crazy. I mean, think about that. That's kind of crazy. But when you think about the timeline, this is over 30 years spanned. And I can't imagine the amount of stories and the amount of things that Mary has heard, and Joseph when he was alive, or even if he still is, we don't know what happened to him. They had heard about Jesus. And they'd seen him be a normal little boy. I'm sure Jesus got angry. I'm sure, we know if we read the Gospels, he does. But he didn't sin. He was still holy, but it would have been hard to probably differentiate that as a human, to see that he's still perfect. He's still holy. And then to see him, and not to start seeing him as your little boy. And when your little boy starts talking about things that are way bigger than you've ever talked about with him and doing things that seem crazy, like casting out demons and healing people, you probably would start to wonder, that's not my boy. He must be, there's something wrong. And I'm sure that's probably what happened to Mary. And we know that this is true, and we know that Jesus knows this because even in Mark 6, when he comes back to his hometown, 1-6, it talks about Jesus talking about how it's hard for a prophet to return to his hometown because people know him as that. And some of you know exactly what this means and have felt this because some of you have come back to your home, or some of you know because you've tried to do something, or maybe you've done something in the past, but you can't, it's really hard for you to live down the label that you've already received. People still see you as the person you used to be, not the person you're becoming. Mary still saw, and his family still saw Jesus for the little boy, the normal little boy that they had to raise, rather than the God he was supposed to be. Like the God that was heaven on earth, this perfect man who was supposed to do something amazing. They had justified it. And so did everybody else, as we read in Mark 6, that everybody saw him just as a carpenter and as Mary's son. Like everybody just saw him as another normal person. But as we know today, he wasn't. But it's so easy sometimes to generalize God and what he's doing over time and over allowing people, allowing the world, allowing the enemy to speak into your life and say, he didn't really say that. You're not really supposed to do that, or you're not really supposed to go there, or it shouldn't be this hard. Stop doing it. Mary, he was just normal. You gave birth to him. I know you know that you didn't have. I know that it was said it was God's son, but was God really? Was that really supposed to be? Why is he this crazy? He shouldn't be doing this. He should be starting to gain power and authority here. He should be starting to become a ruler. This isn't the king that you expected, is it, Mary? Was that really God? Did something crazy happen and you don't even I can't imagine the stories that she was tempted with. Because here's what I know. When I'm doing God's will, when I'm following after God, and I've heard from God and he's asked me to do something, it's not shortly after that that the doubt comes, that the fear comes, that the stories come that should you really do that, Mike? Does that really make sense? That's a big risk. Should you take it? What about your family? What about this? What about that? The enemy is very good at confusing us. The fact is, because of Jesus, the battle's been won, but too often we go down the path of listening to the lies, to the fears, to the stories that he has. And for some reason, Mary, even though she's seen all these miracles, heard from an angel, seen angels, seen God do these amazing things, is now doubting. But the cool thing is that that's not where the story for Mary ends. There's more to it. And if we look at John 19:25 through 27, we get to see Mary pop up one more time. This is now at the end of Jesus' life, and he is carrying his cross, literally heading towards death. And his disciples are there with Mary and his mother Mary and the other Mary, and he sees John and he says, "Take care of my mother. Bring her back into my family." Like, I don't know that if something happened before or Mary's just there because she's there to see a son that she just thinks is her son die, but somehow she's with his disciples. Like, she knows who his spiritual family is, and she's with some of his disciples. And Jesus gives this task to his disciple and says, "Take care of Mary. Take care of my mom. Make her your mom. Be there. Make her a part of the family." And then we know that throughout history, Mary becomes a huge part of the church. And we realize even his brothers and sisters, James, who writes the book of James, his stepbrother becomes a huge key figure in the church. Like, his family gets it finally. I don't know if it's just because this section right here in John is where Mary's soul is pierced and she realized everything that she was told about who Jesus was true, that he was the Son of God, and that her lens that she was looking through, what she expected, didn't happen, but this is exactly what was needed, and now she's back in and understands who God was, and then she's going to turn around her whole entire family and get them to realize Jesus wasn't just their brother. He was the Son of God. He was the Messiah. He was the promised one. And this had to happen so that we could be made right and could have relationship with him. And getting that whole picture finally right then and there, because her soul was pierced and she realized, wow, he still loves me. He still wants me to be a part of the family. And this is what God wanted to do the whole time. I had no idea that this is what it was going to take for him or for me. I had no idea that this is the kingdom that he was bringing down. I don't know. We're not told, but we know from the prophecy of Simeon that that was going to happen, and we know that Mary and her family become a part of the disciple and the movement of the first church. And we know that Jesus asked his disciples, to take care of his mother. There's something there for us. And the fact is, the way I look at it is this. We are all called to sometimes do some things by God that are bigger than us, that don't make sense to us. Now, some of us aren't going to be the magnitude of Mary, and not many of us probably ever will be. The fact that she said yes is an amazing, huge step of faith. But Mary was human. We are human, and God can make us a part of his story. And sometimes when he's calling you in, it's hard to believe. And maybe you're like Mary and need some confirmation. And maybe God has called you to do something and you don't totally understand it. And maybe you need a confirmation like Mary had a confirmation through Elizabeth. I would say if you're wrestling with that you would find someone to talk to process it with, but also be praying to God that you could have that confirmation. Humbly ask him, say, hey, I know this is, maybe you know it's not as big as having the Son of God. Hopefully that's a huge burden to carry, I think. But maybe it is, I don't know. What I'm saying is, what's big to you is big to you, and it doesn't make sense. Maybe you can humbly ask God just to give you a confirmation, to know it's true, to have someone speak into your life truth that he has for you. Maybe you're like Mary and Joseph. Things have happened, you've done a little bit of a leap of faith, and it's now taken longer, or it's been different than what you expected, and you see it as just normal, and you're starting to doubt whether it's even true. Maybe you need to be praying that you can have just a little bit of life, a little bit of hope given to you, and that you wouldn't miss it, because I don't know that Mary didn't miss it when she met Jesus in the house, in the temple, and didn't hear, why wouldn't I be here? Why wouldn't I be in my Father's house? Can you hear that truth again? Ask him, God, just give me hope, give me truth, and don't let me miss it. Or maybe you're so far into it that you've been down this path and it's not looking like anything you wanted it to look like, and you don't understand it, and maybe it's even gotten to the point that you're thinking, God's nuts. And this is crazy. Can you humble yourself and allow him to pierce your spirit and to show you the truth? Because I'm sure it would have been painful for Mary to experience, but also to realize some of the things that she did throughout her story, throughout her lens, weren't right. And that she needed to do something different. She should have been different. Maybe you can't change the past. Maybe you can't change what you did wrong. I know I can't for most of my things. But maybe you can change now to be where God wants you to be. I don't know what God's calling you to. I don't know what God's saying to you. I don't know what that sparks in you as you hear the story of Mary and as you look at through her lens of this birth of Jesus. But one thing I hope is that you can realize that God wants to speak to you, that God wants to use you, that he wants to make you a part of his story, that you are his son and daughter, and that he can use you to do some amazing things. But just as Mary was told that she was favored, I would assume that she had a choice. I assume because God gives us a choice to follow him or not, that Mary had a choice to say yes or no to that son. I don't know. I could be wrong. This could be heresy. I don't know. But I feel like my God is a loving enough God to say, this is what's happening. This could happen. And if she would have said no, that could have been different. Not that God wouldn't have worked eventually, because he would have. But Mary said yes. She took that leap of faith. And I think that's true with you. Sometimes God's asking you to do something. God wants you to go somewhere to do something that doesn't maybe make sense. Like I'm sure that didn't make sense to Mary. But you can trust. So I ask that you would, and I ask that you would seek. Not me, not Sam, not anyone, but God himself. And try to figure out and try to get confirmation through your family. That you would tell somebody about your struggles, that you would tell somebody about what you're thinking, and that you would allow them to help speak truth into your life. And if that truth doesn't come from here, it's probably not truth, me included. And to seek what God is asking you to do, and then ask them to hold you accountable to do it. I'm sure my assumption is that Mary needed Elizabeth more than just to see her that day to get that confirmation about her having the Son of God. We know that John prepared a way. We know that John ended up dying for what he did. And I'm sure as Jesus seemed to be crazy to Mary, that she probably went back to Elizabeth and said, do you still think this is all true? What happened to you, what you told me, do you still think it's all true, or is he crazy? I assume she would need her family. Just like you need your family. We need our spiritual family and our blood family in certain ways. And I want us to be able to hold each other accountable and to help us do what God's asking, because there is great fruit when we're faithful. Mary being faithful and saying yes and allowing to have the Son of God changed our world. And I think we can help change someone else's world if we're faithful to follow God. So my question to you is, what has God been saying or is saying to you? What has he said to you? And what are you doing about it? Are you wrestling with it? Are you taking it to him? Or are you doubting? And do you need truth? Or has it happened and you've seen God work and now you need to tell others about it to give others hope? Just as Mary, I'm sure, give many people hope telling her story after she realized what God was doing after it all worked out, after she saw and had her soul pierced to say, God told me this from the very beginning when Jesus was a baby, that this was going to happen and everybody needs to hear about it. Will you bow with me? Dear Lord, I thank you for being a God who works it all out. For being a God who keeps your promises. For being a God who is faithful. For a God who loves and cares. And Lord, I thank you for being a God who can be bigger than our doubts. That can give us confirmation when you know we need it. That you can give us forgiveness when you know we need it. May that be our identity. May that be our truth. May we not buy into the lies of the enemy, but may we actively seek and do what you're asking us to do. And as that happens, Lord, I pray that we can be like Mary and change other people's story, that we can give hope and love and restoration that can only come from you and through you to others, that they could hear about what you did in our lives and what you're doing in our lives, that it would change people around us who need you so desperately. Some who know, some who have no idea, that are walking around aimlessly in the desert just seeking things that don't even matter. May you show us who those people are. May you show us when we need to speak and when we need to listen, and show us when we need to stop and when we need to do. But may we be in tune with your Spirit that you gave us and that was working way back when, even when Jesus was born, how it moved through Elizabeth and John, and how it moved, your angels moved through dreams and Mary and talking to Mary and Joseph. May that happen again. May we hear from you, and may we do what you're asking us to do. Pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.